the webinar. Okay, welcome everyone to the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice. My name is Jordan Detweiler-Michelson, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and the graduate assistant to the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice. This is our final webinar in a multi-part series on restorative justice in education. It's been a really exciting series. We've tackled issues, hearing from panelists speaking on a range of topics, including the use of restorative justice in disciplinary proceedings and conduct proceedings. We've talked with students who have been trained as peer mediators using RJ processes in their classroom and in their schools. We've talked about the role of RJ in issues of academic integrity, and we've heard from students, administrators, writers in the field trying to get a better sense of the possibility for applying restorative justice in education and a lot of the exciting work that is taking place in that. We have a really excellent panel of speakers today talking about the restorative justice in everyday school practices. Our panel discussion will be facilitated by Kathy Evans, who's a professor in the education department here at the Eastern Mennonite University. This special series is made possible in part by partnership with Coming to the Table, an organization that is dedicated to dismantling racism in America, and they have a special video that they would like to share with us as we begin our webinar today.
Racial reconciliation program affiliated with the Table, a racial reconciliation program affiliated with the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University, is pleased to co-sponsor this webinar series on restorative justice in education. Members of Coming to the Table are dedicated to dismantling the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, strongly support the introduction of restorative justice approaches to school discipline and these school communities as keys to success in this endeavor. Coming to the Table provides leadership and a supportive environment for all who wish to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that is rooted in the United States history of slavery. You can learn more at comingtothetable.org. We hope this webinar series inspires many people to find effective with your community to build a better world today and for future generations.
Great, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to our host, Kathy Evans. Hope everyone enjoys the webinar. I will be back at the end to talk about some exciting announcements and what's taking place at the Zehr Institute and what we have in store. Kathy?
Hi, everyone. I am so excited about today's webinar. Just to give a little bit of history of where we've come in the first two webinar series, which are recorded and you can go back and reference. We talked to students who are actively engaged in leading restorative justice work in their schools. I think that laid a foundation for this is some of the ways that we can see RJ being implemented in classrooms and in school settings. And then in the third, talked to Brenda Morrison and Dorothy Vaandering about relational pedagogy and the importance of underlying relationships. And then last webinar, we did an overview, myself and Joanna McCants-Turner, who is also here at EMU, an overview of restorative justice in school settings, laying down some foundational principles and groundwork about the potential of restorative justice in education to address issues of disproportionality and over-suspension and expulsion. Through the course of those four webinars, we've had so many questions from people about specific practices, but what about when this happens, and what about when this happens? And so it made sense for our last webinar to be a group of practitioners who can speak to some of their experiences and the things that they've learned through doing. And so I'm really excited today to have some practitioners in the field who have been doing this for a while, who can answer some of the questions about everyday nuts and bolts. What does restorative justice look like? And how do we manage to do it well? We have Anne Schumacher, who is from Michigan and has been working with circle processes for a while, and Estelle Archibold and Carolyn Boyce-Watson, both from the Boston area, doing work in school settings, both at an institutional level, higher ed, as well as at a school district level, and I'll let them explain their work. And then Christina Parker, who is in a teacher education program working with restorative justice and equipping teachers for that work. I'm just really thrilled to introduce each of them, and I'm going to let them go through and spend some time explaining their work. They will talk about the work that they're doing with restorative justice in schools, identifying primarily who they're working with and the different practices that they engage with. And I think we'll start with Carolyn, right?
Sure.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Well, greetings, everyone. I am director of the Center for Restorative Justice here at Suffolk University, and we have been around since 1997. The center was founded to be a bridge between the academy and originally the criminal justice system in bringing forth restorative justice practices. We work with police, courts, prisons, probation, just a wider range of agencies. But since 2005, so over the last 10 years, much of our work has been with schools, where we have worked primarily with training K through 12 schools, and we just finished a federal grant with the Boston Public Schools, 18-month training grant with the Boston Public Schools. So we partner with schools who are interested in a whole school approach. We also offer workshops and trainings for individual educators in our work. Our focus is really a circle-based form of restorative practice, and we prefer it, we love it when a school wants to work with us as a whole school approach, but we have also worked with particular grades. Sometimes we work with, a school might want to work just with their middle school. We have worked with individual classroom teachers who want to begin this in their classroom. We've worked with after-school programs. We've also been called in to work with adults and staff and to work with the workplace culture and climate within schools, just with adults. So, as I said, in our work, we really like to begin with circles as a foundation for relationship building. We're very often brought in over concerns with the school tuition pipeline. We're very often brought in, as we were in Boston, with under the intention to reduce suspensions and expulsions and to find alternatives. And, the sort of people wanting skills around their sort of reactive alternatives to punitive discipline. And we do offer that kind of support and training, but we like to shift people in the direction initially in the use of circles as a more proactive way to address the positive culture and climate within the school. And that's usually where we try to begin. We oftentimes say sort of three shapes. There's the triangle, a square, and a circle. And if you understand these three shapes, you'll understand restorative practices. So familiar with the triangle, we really do have a lot of conviction that 80% of the time a school should really be investing in its energy into building positive relationships among students and teachers, among staff, among adults, with parents, with non-teaching staff. So we really kind of begin there. We also very early on try to teach people the square, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I don't know if you refer to it as the social control window or the what we call the restorative justice mental model, trying to encourage people to see the difference between working with others as opposed to either doing things to them or for them. So we hand out a nifty little card which has the restorative questions on it and tips for circles. And we really try to encourage people to learn this mental model. But then we initially start our work very much on introducing people to circles. We find that if we can really transfer the skills of using talking circles within maybe a day or so of good training with teachers. And we find that once people, students and staff are using circles as relationship building and community building and talking circles, they will very quickly, it's a very small step for them to be using them when things go wrong and for using them in a more reactive way. So we like to really embed that in the culture. We use the manual Circle Forward quite a bit, which really uses circles for all kinds of things, beginning with setting classroom norms, getting to know each other, pedagogical practices with circle, and then kind of building up to the capacity to both have what we call important but difficult conversations in circle. We have a very strong intention on opening up conversations about exclusion, about racism, about oppression, in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of contexts. And then also building up to really using the practice with conflict and for resolving conflict. We also offer training in conferencing and discipline, but we find that we could do that with a small number of people within the school. So that could be done for sort of very specific individuals who can come in and run conferences, whereas the circle practice we see as a very broad kind of practice that everybody can access, as well as kind of the restorative mental model that everyone can access. So I think I'll just close by saying that it's never the same journey in any school. It's always unique. We really try to meet people where they are and to meet their needs and kind of build on their strength when we work with any secondary school. So that's kind of the basics for our practice.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Sure.
Estelle.
Yes.
Could you go next?
I can.
Great.
I'm really excited to be a part of this panel, and I was originally introduced to restorative practices, restorative justice, actually through my seminary work. So I went to seminary at the Candler School of Theology and then later at Boston University. But I had a career in education prior to that, and little did I know all of the things that I was trying to accomplish in my classroom had a name, restorative justice, restorative practices. So as a part of my work, not only in the classroom, but also abroad, I work with the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the ground with religious leaders and educational leaders to try to, really make sure that more than the elite were engaged in the practice of building educational foundations for children and students in Liberia. Really gave me a real opportunity to understand what the potential impact of restorative justice could be for disenfranchised and marginalized people. So flash forward to my time here in Boston, I started a movement, I would say, and it started with a movement of one, and it was painful in the beginning. But I work with Prospect Hill Academy Charter School now as an administrator, systems level administrator. We are a school of 4 campuses, K to 12. And in about 2012, 2013, we decided we needed a different approach to building culture and positive climate at our school. We were seeing some of the typical things that our nation's schools see. we were seeing that our African American boys and Latino boys were on the margins with regard to their engagement, specifically in the classroom and in the school community. But we were also seeing wide gaps between their achievement levels and those of many of their counterparts, which include a very small in comparison percentage of white students and young ladies here at Prospect Hill Academy. So I began this movement and I sought help. And then I got connected to the Center for Restorative Justice in Boston and was introduced to Carolyn by a great friend and mentor, Tom Porter. And the rest was history with regard to my relationship with the Center for Restorative Justice. Through that relationship, I've worked with many, many, many school districts in the Northeast. I've even had the opportunity to travel down south and work with a couple of schools. And this has really given me an opportunity and a platform to understand with more depth what it is that we're trying to accomplish for our children. So that's kind of my background.
Good. When you say that you go down south and work with some schools, can you talk about a little bit more about what that looks like when you do that?
Oh, definitely. It looks a lot like what Carolyn was speaking to earlier. There are some schools who want us to come in at the beginning of a school year and do a big blast on general or basic restorative practices like circle process and other community building aspects of restorative approaches to building positive school climates. There are other schools, for example, Atlanta Public Schools. I've recently been contacted by them because I'm an alum in Atlanta Public Schools, and Atlanta is my home. I don't know if you all could tell the Southern accent there. Been recently contacted by them because they actually want to begin to implement this kind of opportunity more wholesale at a district level and want to know what it takes. I mean, so some of this is about training administrators, not only at the district level, but also at the building level. And the other part of it is training communities, which I would include teachers there at the grassroots level. I actually would include students as well. I mean, so not only down south, but also up here in the Northeast, what I'm finding is that people are understanding that this last 2 decades of the accountability era in the United States have had some great things about it, but a lot of things were missing for them, particularly as regards how districts have taken on a lot of zero tolerance or even no excuses approaches to discipline. It hasn't made things better. It's actually widened gaps, and it's not given our most vulnerable children access to the things they need within the school. The school is not only for academic endeavors. That is one of its primary purposes, but it is also other forms of development such as social emotional development that students need in order to function in the world beyond the school. How do we begin to build connectedness from students' lives at home and in their communities to the school? We have to start thinking about strategies. And when I think about restorative justice, those are the big payoffs there. What students are learning in the classroom and at school has to be relevant to them. Why else go to school, right?
Thanks, Estelle.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll come back and do some good cross conversations here in a moment. Anne, could you talk a little bit about your work in Michigan?
Yes. Hi. Thank you for inviting me to be on this webinar. My background is actually originally in mediation, and through this work in mediation, doing some victim offender mediation and also working in the civil courts, I came across restorative justice, and somehow I just felt that is what will make a major change in our whole approach to the educational, the pipeline to jail problem. And a community that I work in Detroit is called Hamtramck, and it's a small community that was able to put together some funds for bringing in restorative practices, but they only had enough money for the 2 elementary and the middle school to bring in a restorative practice coordinator. They didn't have any money for the high school, which is where most of the suspensions were taking place. So I was going back to school and working on a dissertation, and decided to volunteer in this high school to set up talking circles because they had no other restorative practices programs in the high school. And so that was 6 years ago. And since then, I've been doing these talking circles, and I'll define, the way I define this talking circle is that I have 5 or 6, I mainly focus working with the girls, and they're between the ages of 14 and 18. And there's 5 or 6, sometimes 7 in a group, and we meet once a week. I get them out of class with the permission of the principal and support. And we basically focus, I had 2 goals. One, to build, help build positive relationships, positive and healthy relationships, and to provide a support structure, but also to focus on what Estelle and Carolyn were talking about, emotional literacy skills. And so, of course, conflict would develop in the circle, and we would work it out. And I run now about 11 circles during the week, and then 2 gentlemen we trained were running about 6 male circles. So at one point this last year, we were having about 17 circles, weekly circles in the school. Now, this community has about 23 languages spoken, so we have a really diverse community, and some of the girls in my circles are from Bangladesh, Yemen, Pakistan, African American, white, Polish, Russian, everywhere, from all over the world, actually. So these circles have been really wonderful for bringing together different ethnic groups and helping, like one group, just for an example, I had two Yemen, 2 African American, and 2 Bosnians. And so it was amazing. They stayed together, some of these groups stayed together for 4 years, and this one group was together for about 4 years. And it was amazing to see the exchange of experiences, even though they came from 3 particularly different cultures. The circles are, I take 50, we're on a block schedule. And so that was how to work that out. So I take them out of class at a half of one of their blocks, which is about 45 to 50 minutes. And yeah, I think that's all I would say for right now. But I'm just now getting started. It takes a little while to get the circles started. I prefer not to have people assign me circles. So I start with one girl, and then I have her ask have her choose who she would like to be in this circle. And that seems to work better, because once I can get the buy-in of one girl, then the whole circle then seems to just flower. So I think I'll stop there for now, but that gives sort of a background.
Thanks, Anne.
Mm-hmm.
And Christina.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. So I have been teaching through conflict resolution. I've been integrating a lot of restorative justice practices. I've been teaching conflict resolution not only to teacher candidates, but also to people within the human services or community services, such as child and youth care workers or social workers as well. And it's really interesting, because when a lot of these practitioners are coming into the classroom trying to think about conflict resolution or restorative justice, they're immediately trying to find ways to, come up with that model or that strategy, like give me the model and let me do it, and let me just look at really focusing on post-incident conflict tools that are supposedly within a box. And listening to all of you talk about the wonderful powers of the circle and the transformative nature of the circle, it's really hard to put those methodologies in a one-size-fits-all box that would really normalize a lot of these pedagogies and can create exclusion for some others. So what I found in my work in the study that I did with Dr. Kathy Bickmore and myself on novice teachers' responses to conflict is that a lot of these teachers didn't feel equipped to manage conflict in the classroom once they graduated from their teacher education program. And particularly, a lot of them felt unprepared to deal with conflict as it connected to different cultural identities of their students. For instance, one teacher felt that she had ongoing conflicts in her classroom, and it was because a number of her students didn't look her in the eye. And it was only till later she realized that those students who were a group of new immigrants from a particular area that where they felt it was disrespectful to look at their teacher in the eye. And because of that, they actually were able to address conflict in a different way after realizing that. So one thing that I have been really trying to think about in my own practice is how do we not only integrate different ways for looking at restorative practices, but also paying attention to the cultural responsive practices or the culturally sustaining practices that can really nurture the kind that students are bringing in training teachers to be I need to pay attention to training them to be culturally responsive and culturally equipped to manage different types of conflicts within contexts of diversity. So what a part of my work has been doing is sort of breaking down a lot of those prescribed and normative ways that a lot of these teachers have been trained in their own schooling experience and trying to find alternative ways to look at conflict. My own dissertation work was looking at peace-building education in culturally diverse classrooms, so really trying to look at proactive ways to resolve conflict. How do we actually integrate conflict into the curriculum in ways that we can actually take issues and learn from them? So paying attention to social justice and equity and power, and really trying to connect it to curriculum content in ways that are restorative. So essentially, my work really pays attention to how much identity matters in looking at restorative practices in the classroom.
Great. So just following up, one of the things that I've heard everybody talk about is this sense of using restorative justice practices as a way to build healthy communities and climates. Do you think that there's a distinction between that kind of practice and the other kind of practice where we're more responding to a particular incident? And so how can we help people understand the ways that circles or what other processes we have can be used? So maybe just speak to a little bit more of this proactive versus responsive. And I will open that up to anyone who feels like they want to jump on that.
So I'll make a really quick comment about that. We very often really do encourage people, and one of the ways that we explain it to teachers or schools right away, which is saying, if you think about when something goes wrong, a restorative process is oftentimes trying to leverage the desire for people to get back into a good relationship, to restore the relationship back to what it was before the incident caused harm or the incident caused some kind of disruption between people. But that if you don't actually have good relationships in the first place, you really find that you're sort of standing on quicksand in terms of restoring things back, because there's a lot of ongoing harm in relationships that people feel are unjust. And I think that if you really look at a school, a lot of young people in particular, but many other people as well, do not really feel, they don't feel that they're being heard, they don't feel that they're being valued, they don't feel they're being respected, they don't feel like they belong. So if you look at all those factors, they really are part of what, and we're all human and people are going to make mistakes and they're going to hurt each other, but the foundation is that people want to be in good relationship with each other. And so if you aren't kind of nurturing good relationships in the first place, it's very hard to repair relationships and to restore them back to something. And so I think that's, we just kind of point that out, and that makes a lot of sense to people. And so then they see the logic of moving in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. That's why I think having these long-term talking circles in a school, like in the instance of these groups that have been together 4 years, they often would bring to the circle room and to me girls that were not part of the circle who were in conflict, and could we sit together in circle and work it out. So it started with the group that had been together for a long time and building positive, healthy relationships, and they saw someone outside the circle needing help. So I think I agree with Carolyn. It's about building the relationships first that are proactive rather than having to wait till the end and just having these reactive circles dealing with an issue. So.
That's a really great point, Anne. And I think it's also, when thinking about preparing students to deal with these conflicts, looking at curriculum integration is really wonderful too. Whether it's, when they're reading a short story or a poem, trying to identify elements of justice and inequity, talking about it through a circle, they're already familiar with the process and that way of communicating with one another. And if conflict does occur, they have the tools to be able to deal with it. So really interesting work that you're doing.
Yeah, I would just add that I would want to think about and encourage others to think about practice more broadly. So we're focusing in on teacher practice and direct work with students, but it may also be a good idea to think about leader practice in school settings, and how is it that leaders can be proactive in their work with each other and with their teachers to set the stage or to create a landscape within which the teacher practice in the classroom can actually thrive within a system that's functioning well. So that's a different spin on practice, but it's a very important thing to consider, because in my practice here and in other schools, what you often notice, and maybe this resonates with some of the other panelists, is that teachers, although they can close that door to the classroom and temporarily work within a vacuum or their own community, so to speak, that they develop, they have to open that door up, and they have to let the elements of the broader school community in. And if those elements or those aspects of the school community aren't supporting restorative practice, so for example, aren't supporting a systemic approach to resolving conflict through how discipline is dealt with as an entire school community, a lot of their efforts don't go as far as they could. So another example of that may be even thinking at a very practical level about how do we structure our schedule, day to day, to support not only some of the learning, but some of the time to address conflicts that come up, so that students don't have this sense of, okay, I've been wronged, or a teacher doesn't have the sense of, I really know something is happening here, but I don't have the time to address it. And the issue festers and never gets addressed because the time or the space in the schedule isn't allocated toward it. So how we approach structuring our schools through our systems, our schedules, how we allocate resources, is also a matter for us to consider with regard to restorative approaches to building schools.
Thank you. I still want us to get, I like the language of let's expand what we mean by practice. So I'm a teacher educator myself, and so sometimes I have felt like maybe I wasn't doing restorative justice practice because I'm not in a P-12 school. And so for me, expanding my definition means that the practice occurs in whatever I'm doing. So in my work with teaching teachers, both about instruction, Christina, and pedagogy and curriculum, as well as in conflict kinds of things. In what other ways are we expanding this notion of practice? Maybe we could just address that a little bit, to include more than just circle practices or conferencing. Like, what is the broad array of practices that we can be involved in? And just maybe articulate some of those, maybe itemize some of those. I think people think about circle processes or conferencing. What else are we talking about when we talk about restorative practices?
So, Kathy, this is a really interesting question because I often, when I'm asked to speak about restorative justice in front of let's say a room full of people, often an underlying question that is not asked, but you can really tell is there. So does that mean that I throw all of my good teacher practice out of the window and then I adopt this system called restorative justice and it's going to make everything better? And the thing that I always like to tell educators is that, good educator practice is actually restorative practice, first and foremost. So there are some basic practices I think that we adopt that help us remember much about the principles and the mindset of a restorative approach. Circle practice is one of them. Conferencing is one of them. Restorative inquiry, is another one. But eventually, a restorative approach to building a positive school community or positive classroom community is really a creative endeavor. It's the ability to meet that group of people, whoever they are, adults, students, or a combination thereof, where they are so that they can manage the difference in the classroom and use the commonalities to build or to create or to construct new knowledge that benefits that community. So I often think about restorative approach and restorative practice, again, as a practice that revolves around several axes of values that spur out many creative solutions or approaches to dealing with the different things that come up in different contexts.
Thank you. Yeah, somebody else.
Yeah, just to connect to that, Estelle, I think you're right. It's not just about, while coming into circle and into conferencing is one element, but also the effective statements that you're sharing with your students, the different ways conflict is managed on a daily basis. I know one teacher, for instance, shared with me that one strategy she used to control the students in her class where she had different jars, and depending on how good they were, they would get marbles in their jars, and by the end of the school year, there were some that had a lot and some who had very little and probably gave up at a certain point because they were so excluded because of that process. After participating in training in restorative practices, restorative justice, she actually decided that she was going to make a collective classroom jar where, together they would work together to have these marbles. So it's interesting when, moving from this individualistic approach that could be somewhat punitive to something that's more collective and connecting to those values that you talked about, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and I want to kind of also sort of, bring the attention back to, I think that what both Christina and Estelle referred to, which is this idea of values, that I think that we really encourage everyone to think about what would it be like to create a community where everybody felt a sense of belonging. Everyone is going to either feel belonging or not belonging in a relationship to their community. And I think that, their approach to this work. And I think that one of the things that it's really important, I was recently at a school, and I think sometimes men sometimes feel that their style isn't welcome in a restorative approach. And I think that I've seen a lot of incredibly talented teachers, male teachers, who might have a style of engaging with youth, which is really, as it were, very much honoring the individuality of the youth and really respecting them, but their style, they feel like their style doesn't fit with a restorative approach. And I think that that's a misunderstanding. I think you really want to affirm the practice that people have when they're bringing different ways that they've discovered to really acknowledge the autonomy and the growth of all of the members of their classroom, and including other adults. And I think that it doesn't always look the same, but what we really want to do is kind of come back to a discussion on values and open that door to people talking about their values and what it is that they're really trying to, what they're really trying to do in an educational setting, and kind of reconnect with oftentimes many aspirations that teachers have, and they feel that there isn't a place for some of these aspirations in the way that the schooling has evolved in recent years.
Anne, anything to add there?
No, I would just say that I agree with Carolyn that, some of the obstacles that I faced in the beginning, it's much less so now. In fact, I have really, I think, almost 100% support in the school. But in the beginning, many people did not understand the whole process and didn't want to get involved in this touchy-feely kind of restorative practices, restorative justice was whatever they would say. And I think Carolyn or Estelle said something about teachers. Some of our teachers felt overloaded, that they didn't have time to learn something new. And I think that it's important to explain that this is really about teaching values and respect, and it starts with the teachers in the classroom. And so I think that if somehow teachers can be helped to see that this is not a touchy-feeling sort of approach. This is approach about being whole and bringing a community environment into the school that's grounded in well, I have to say love, and grounded in care. And so, I'm not in that position as the three of you are, or four of you are, but I have seen that people have changed over time when they've seen the benefits of these restorative processes.
I can only smile when you balk at the word love. I know that that's one of those words we have so much trouble talking about in the education world, and it's so unfortunate.
It's really, I say this is the core of our circle, and if you've got a problem with it, they don't have a problem. But I think I just wanted to show that this book had such an impact on me. It's called The Soul of Education by Rachel Kessler. And she's one of the women, she spoke about how beautiful it would be if students in a school could get together and just sit and reflect on life. And I think that that's what restorative practices does. It helps bring people back to who they are, to the core of who we are as humans.
Well, I know in Carolyn and Kay's book, the Circle Forward book that Carolyn held up a minute ago, there are those 4 underlying assumptions.
7, actually.
Oh, there are 7 underlying assumptions. There's 4 of the let's talk about this, and this. You're right. 7 underlying assumptions, and one of those is that at our core we are beautiful, amazing human beings, and that what restorative justice does is take us back to that core. And so I'm really glad to bring that up. I can imagine that there would be somebody listening, though, that would say they are starting from a different place. And so, like, that children need to be trained to be their best self, and that they aren't starting out that way. And so I think sometimes those are difficult conversations to have. And we could probably unwrap those a little bit, and maybe we'll come back to those. We're veering into principles and values, which is what I love too. And I love to talk about the underlying principles and values of restorative justice, because to me, and I've heard Estelle say it, and I've heard Carolyn say it, that it's not so much what we are doing, as long as what we are doing is consistent with those values. And so what Christina talks about with is instruction. Like, our instruction has to be consistent with the values of restorative justice. And so to me, it does come back to those values over and over. Yes. So I made a comment to someone the other day that standing in the front of the school early in the morning and waving to students as they arrive and really greeting them with a a heartfelt welcome, that could be very much of a restorative practice, and could make a huge difference in the day for that child.
Kathy, I think you said something that I really wanted to address a bit, and that is that even our instruction has to be consistent with restorative values. And I really appreciate that, because here at the school where I am now, Prospect Hill Academy, we decided that because we can't separate climate and culture from instruction, they are, intimately interconnected. We had to find a way to articulate a restorative approach to instruction. And of course, Dr. Morrison's work Brenda Morrison's work was very helpful in doing that. But it's interesting you say that. When we sit down, we have a board of trustees, and they're all about academic achievement. Okay, yes, restorative justice, and how does that impact student development and academic achievement? So being able to articulate that even how you approach instruction in the classroom, even the idea of high support but high accountability at the same time, really helped us frame our vision of what we call restorative instruction here at PHA. But being able to work with teachers to identify that fine dance that you're doing between support and accountability has been our current growing edge. And I'm very curious to hear from the other practitioners, how does that play out in the classroom, particularly you, Christina, as you talk about embedding restorative instruction in the curriculum. How is it that we begin to encourage teachers to walk that fine line, or to have that really great balance of support and high expectations or high accountability within the classroom setting?
Yeah, that's a great question, Estelle. And I think it's tricky, because a lot of the times, after talking to teachers and trying to get them to think about, okay, how do you integrate circles in your classroom? A lot of the things I've heard are, my boys would never be able to sit in circle, or, my entire class is autistic and, they just can't do it. And another teacher recently said, well, 2 kids in the class can barely look at each other. If I put them together in circle, desks will definitely start to be thrown. And, this is the situation that's going to happen. And and it's a process that is really challenging to try to think about, okay, well, if there's so much resistance to even coming together in circle, how do we even, think about building these relationships? And a lot of it is a structural approach within the classroom. It involves the administrator supporting what teachers are doing. Just this morning, I was speaking to a principal trying to think about, how we can incorporate more restorative practices into their school with one of their teachers who's really interested in it. And he said to me, you're welcome to come into my class to think about, classroom dialogue, and as long as it connects to the curriculum. But anything outside of that, if you're going to be doing a circle where you're talking about conflict, we can't have that in my school, because we don't have conflict here, and 2, we don't have time to deal with the touchy-feely stuff, because our students are from a low-income community, and they have too much stuff, and we don't want them bringing it into school. And with that kind of structural situation, it's really challenging for teachers to really think about, okay, well, now I'm actually scared to together in circle because my administrator doesn't think I'm doing the academic work. So how do we actually get buy-in from the institution to actually see that, this work is very important, and in ways that, yes, it does help increase opportunities for academic engagement. Because, if we're working with a teacher who is taking a short story or taking, different elements, characters from history, and they're putting them together, they're giving them roles, they're sitting in circle, they're trying to figure out ways to, take on different perspectives, grapple with different types of conflicts and issues, and talk about it. You're developing their communication skills, their appetite for engaging with other different types of perspectives, and also finding ways to confront injustice, finding ways to confront different divergent points of view as well. So it involves not something that can just happen automatically, where you're just going to all of a sudden have a circle and things will change, but a process. And it starts from day one in the classroom, and thinking about ways to which you can build the kind of community that that you've all been talking about, and going from there to purposely invite conflict as a learning opportunity for further growth.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I'll be very brief with this. One of the ways that we are finding to be a very wonderful entry point is through looking at collaborative learning strategies with our teachers. And so there's a lot of literature out there on collaborative learning strategies and development of social emotional skills. And because we know that restorative practices really reinforces the acquisition and the development of social emotional skills, I think that there's a natural, a natural intersection there as well in that literature.
Yeah, most definitely.
And I just want to emphasize too that I think that, we tend to really focus on thinking about work that we're doing with the students and with the youth, but I think that a lot of this is really culture is indivisible, and you can't have one culture for how you work with the students if there's a different culture in how the staff work with one another and how they work with their administrators, and whether their own learning is supported, whether they have the opportunity to come together and reflect. Even at the level, Kathy, when we were talking earlier about, do you really believe that every student in your classroom is able to learn? Do you really believe that every student in your classroom has a core self that is good, wise, and powerful? Do you believe that about your colleagues? Do you believe that about yourself? I mean, these are challenging questions for all of us. And I think that one of the things about, particularly about the idea of a growth mindset and a learning mindset, is one that what is good for the students is also good for the adults, and it's kind of one culture. And so, when a school takes on this as a journey, I think that it's pretty limited if they only think that this is about the students and not also about the adults. And fairly early on, I think that most schools who take this on in a deeper way realize that it is very much about their relationships with one another, their relationships with themselves and their own fears, and in their own, how do they handle when they make mistakes? What is the climate in which they feel that they can get the support and accountability with one another and with those who are in charge of supervising them, and so on and so forth. So it's a very deep journey that that they take on, because this is not the culture that, for the most part, we're operating in most schools. So, but it feels really constructive and good, which is the good news, the more that people engage in it.
Yes. How many times have you gotten a phone call from a school or a district or principal saying, I've got some students who are having some troubles. We'd like to do some restorative justice with them. Yeah. They're the problem.
Well, I always say that, when I'm called in, I'm always called in to say, kind of, you're here to change the kids. How do we change the kids? And I oftentimes say, well, I'm actually really here to change the adults, because when the adults change, the kids will change. But I usually don't say that because I don't think I'll get asked back again until they are a little further along in the process, and then I can say it. But, if you said that right off the bat, because nobody wants to feel like they're being changed. And, so I think it's kind of a gentle process.
Just to follow up real quick, I think earlier you were talking about, one of you was talking about finding things that we're already doing. The language that we're using here a lot is the appreciative inquiry model, finding what people are already doing well and building on that, that we're not looking for somebody to come in and implement a program. And so when we talk about restorative practices, it's a set of skills, obviously, that we hope that teachers and administrators and students can pick up, that is consistent with restorative justice principles and values. But acknowledging that many of those things are already happening, that people are already doing a lot of very restorative things. And so finding ways to work with them to identify those things so that they can be done more intentionally with a greater focus. Yeah. Sometimes, however, there are practices that I think that they aren't doing, they don't know about them. Like, I think there are times when we do walk in and say, here's a tool, here's a resource, here's an available support that might work for your school. Could you talk, each of you, a little bit about what it looks like to go in and get those relationships started at the beginning? How to initiate those kinds of, here's something you might consider. How do we do that in ways that are honoring of the schools and the teachers that we're working with?
Yeah, I'll offer one, and this was a practice that I took on early, and it has served me well, not only in my own practice with students, but also in my training with teachers. At the beginning of every school year, I would embed within the first week of classes one-on-one conferences with my set of students. So if I had 100 students, I had 100 conferences at the beginning of the year, and then I did those every quarter, along with all of the other things that I would be doing to build relationships. But that initial one-to-one conference with the student, looking that student eye to eye, being able to observe as a practitioner who this student is, how they're bringing their body, into the classroom, how they might feel about themselves, was very powerful for me. It allowed me not only to make a connection first off with that student, but it allowed me to assess one-on-one potentially how I could reach that student in a larger classroom setting. Another thing I did was shared journaling. And these are common practices. This is good educator practice, but it's restorative practice. But even as I was a math teacher, I had my kids keep a journal. And at the end of every week, I would collect those journals and I would give them prompts throughout the week, asking them, what was the most difficult things? Not rocket science here. Why was it difficult? What were you thinking about? Could this connect with anything that you were encountering in your community? And we would have a dialogue via journal over a week about these things. Those are relationship building activities, and they definitely helped me set a tone in my classroom, a positive tone.
Someone else? Anne.
Well, I could just talk a little bit. I'm not a teacher in the classroom, so I entered this high school pretty much as a grassroots. Nobody really had any experience with restorative practices, and I can just tell you a little bit about how I built some bridges with the adults, because that was the first step. And I started out with the curriculum director of the district and said I'd like to volunteer to do this, and set up a little pilot project. And then I went to the assistant principal and a principal, and basically just started out with practically nothing. And I got the social, I needed someone in the school to help me find some girls. And so a social worker volunteered, and that's how it started. And then I went from, gradually I met the teachers there, and I talked to them about what these circle processes were like and what I'd like to do. And then they invited me back after this pilot project. And each year I've tried to, I've been there now 6 years, and I've tried to just keep building these relationships. And as the circles have been more and more successful, the students are telling the teachers about the impact of the circles on them. So it started out with one, and it's sort of mushroomed into like the whole school now. So.
I just want to jump in here to say that I also am I'm a university educator, but not a K through 12 educator. But I have now been working with so many K through 12 educators. And I sort of, just as Estelle described that she had these practices before she put a name of, would even begin to describe them as restorative practices. What I'm discovering in the 18 months that we trained literally several hundred Boston public school teachers who came to this training on their own initiative with the support of their principal, that so many of them had similar relational practices in the classroom, ways that they connected with students of all ages, very stylistically different, that they had honed over the years as things that really were effective for and in love with their students and creating that bond, and it was all part of their pedagogical practice. And so many of them felt that they were that was no longer honored in the larger school. So going back to Estelle's idea that there is a role for administrators and to kind of acknowledge what does it mean to move in this way. I found so many classroom teachers who had so many successful practices that they right now didn't feel that in the climate of testing and data-driven work, and they feel under so much pressure to do so many other things, that the relational practices that they had developed were, they struggled to keep them going, and they never really felt that those were really acknowledged by anyone. And they had so many of these I would call them wise practices that they had in the classroom that were successful. And when we said, but that's very restorative, they were really affirmed. You mean I've been doing this all along? And yes, so I think that we've come through an era where I think teacher wisdom hasn't been as respected as it needs to be. And that there's been a sort of top-down, and maybe not everywhere, but certainly in the school systems that I've been involved with, a sort of top-down sense that they need to cover the curriculum, teach to the test. There's a real tyranny of the test going on, and really a sense that they don't get any support for doing these relational practices, that they believe that came out of their time-honored wisdom of what it is to run a successful classroom and to bond with children, year after year after year. I'm working with people who had been teaching for 20, 30, 40 years in the system. And so in challenging urban school systems. So there's so much wisdom out there that I think right now has been somewhat kind of under the radar, that is really part of really being a good restorative educator. That's really, people are already, it's kind of, restorative justice and restorative practices aren't new, but we sort of do need a renaissance in a way of them. So.
Yeah, I like to think about, what do teachers do during the first week of school? And I invite my teacher candidates to actually take the time to think about that. What kinds of questions would you ask of your students during the first week of school? What would you do? How would you set up your classroom? What would it look like? And that's really building that strong foundation, really taking the time to critically reflect on what you're doing. How are you organizing the class? How are you dealing with conflict? How are you, creating an environment where there is collaboration, where there is a consensus-based process to making decisions about groupings, to making decisions about how you want to structure things. So, the first week or the first month of school even really tells a lot about how the rest of the year will go. So really taking the time to critically reflect on that is really important for teachers, and also for them to have the opportunity to experience these processes themselves. So, in my own classes, I have them think about, well, what kinds of questions would you want to ask? And then we actually practice doing it and facilitating it so that the teachers actually have the opportunity to be in the circle, to experience what it would feel like to be in that type of classroom. And also leading up to training where they actually are facilitating peacemaking circles, so in role play. So they actually are going to manage a conflict, and they're going to take on different roles, and they're going to do it in a circle, and they each have the opportunity to be a facilitator. So as one strategy for preparing our educators to facilitate these processes, because a lot of them really don't have the confidence to do it. And part of what we can do in our work is really try to develop tools and strategies to help build the confidence for a lot of educators to use these processes throughout their schools.
Pause for a second. Anybody want to jump in, add to anything that's been said there?
I will. I really appreciate this, Christina, your emphasis on building teacher confidence. And especially with our new teachers who come and are really, in some aspects, trying to figure out not only who they are in the classroom, but who they are. It's really important for them to get connected to reflective activity. And when I think about circle process with adults and with new teachers sitting in circles, it really gives them the time to think about who they are. Like, what am I doing here? And that is critical to good educator practice, having the time to be reflective, to think about and process, would I make a change there? Why did I do that? I wonder how that impacted the kids when I said that. So having the opportunity, like you said, in your classroom settings with teachers, actually, them going through it and understanding the value of that for themselves helps them translate that value to their students as well. So I really appreciated that. Thank you for that.
And I'll jump in here too to say that I think, again, I would really think it's so important to use talking circles among teachers so they can reflect together, and so that you can start to have the, kind of sharing of wisdom from older teachers to younger teachers, and different people have different styles and all kinds of ways in which they're bringing different things to the classroom, and have a space where they are actually on a regular basis in a really positive and supportive environment, sharing their challenges and practices and struggles together in a positive way. And I very rarely see that in a school. It just doesn't seem to be built into the school environment, which is a tremendous loss, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the way we approach professional development in a lot of our public school settings is beginning to take a turn, but was not in the best place, especially for a lot of large districts, Carolyn, that you and I have recently worked with. Professional development is not just this workshopping, that we've seen. So there have been long histories of bringing in the expert putting on a show, and then they get shipped out and they may leave a couple of things behind, worksheets and templates, but then that's it. We really have to start looking at not only peer mentoring, which is very important, which is, I think, what Carolyn is speaking to when she talks about teachers sharing their practice in circles, but also some really intentional ways of coaching teachers and giving them feedback. There's a loop that needs to be happening that's also very supportive, and therefore can be very accountability driven without being about the checklist and the evaluation form at the end of the day. You have someone checking in with you regularly about, what did you think about when you did that? Your view of accountability changes, and I think in a very important way. Accountability becomes supportive then.
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because it speaks to what Carolyn was talking about with regard to some of the cultural pieces in education right now that seem to inhibit this kind of work in schools, because people are so driven by tests. And it's been told that that's about accountability. And I think what you're talking about, Estelle, is we can have accountability and still really focus on building healthy and responsive climates and cultures in schools that are restorative, and those aren't mutually exclusive. So we can't say, like, well, here we are doing restorative justice, so therefore we're not going to meet the academic standards or the accountability measures. No, those two things should go together. In some places, however, though, like, teachers are telling me, I can't do that in my school, though, because I'm not allowed to, or nobody's, giving me permission to do this. I have to spend this amount of time doing reading instruction, or this amount of time doing math work. And so there's not time built in, which is what we were talking earlier about structures. I know that that's a challenge for some teachers. Are there ways that we can encourage them to get around those? Or should they just, I don't know.
So Kathy, you're talking about how administrators may impose certain expectations based on district expectations?
Yes, and so much focus on getting ready for tests and not seeing the ways that this actually will help students do better academically. So I think the failure to make those connections is creating some of that. So how should teachers navigate those waters and keep their job?
That is a really great question, and it can be a lot of pressure on a teacher. So
Yeah.
we're relying on teachers actually to be aware of best practice literature and to begin to speak administrators speak, right? So this is about managing up and having those skills to manage up, which coincidentally might fit into the conflict transformation category, which you can learn about through a restorative approach, right? Mm-hmm. But that's an awesome question. And now that I think about it, I was that teacher when I was trying this work out in my first year of teaching, and the school system just wasn't there. My school wasn't there yet. And I'll be honest with you, I connected with parents, and I also made a way for kids to shine. And then I gave the rationale of these approaches that I used as the reason why they're shining. So I tried to create success, and then I backtracked through the rationale for my administrators, and that was successful for me. But I do think teachers are experiencing an inordinate amount of pressure when they have to go up against, quote unquote, an administrator group, and the administrators don't quite understand what restorative approaches are yet. I would suggest that they connect with centers like the Center for Restorative Justice, at Suffolk University, and the Institute for Restorative Justice at EMU, the Zehr Institute, so that they can find other like-minded people. I mean, sometimes it's about support to keep at it, and to keep resisting and engaging in ways are most healthy for kids and community.
And I just want to make a note, like, I'm not picking on building administrators. Many times the building administrator is completely on board as well, but they're feeling that same pressure from school board, from the state. So like wherever those pressures are coming, like how do we navigate those tensions? So I'm speaking specifically from teachers to administrators, but it could be anywhere along that chain of command. Can I say that?
Yeah. I just say, I think it's about movement building. You have to be able to find like-minded people sometimes that support one another and give each other strategies and can speak with one another to groups that don't quite understand yet.
I also think that and just to build on that, given that the movement really is, it is maturing as a movement. I mean, this is now, we are really a good solid decade into the time when schools are starting to implement restorative practices. So I do think that there are now outcomes that are demonstrating the impact on academic achievement that, and obviously Oakland, the most recent research done on the Oakland school system shows that really there's increase in reading scores and math scores, and that, in addition to, the obvious ones where they're having better attendance, you can't learn very much if kids are being excluded and not coming to school, but that this is really supporting learning. And I think one of the things the pioneers have had to really do that kind of out front and make the case that, that these are linked. And I think theoretically it's pretty clear that they are linked. But now we have some outcomes that are starting to really show in a much more definitive way that these have positive academic outcomes when it's practiced consistently and school-wide. I just want to say, too, that when we get the rare opportunity to work with a whole school, we are very intentional about then engaging all levels of the community in a learning process around what restorative practice is, what restorative justice in the context of the school means, and then what it would mean for their particular job and role in the school. So from students to teachers to administrators to, in the case of charter schools, their board members, and really work, and we try to bring them together cross-sector. And really, when we have the opportunity to work with a whole school, we really systematically work so that everybody's on the same page. We really encourage, we just started a school year with the entire school, including the janitor staff and secretaries and everybody sitting for a full day of training on restorative practices. The entire, and that was a big commitment for that school to give over a whole day for the whole school to learn this, but they had made a commitment that this was going to be something that they were doing as a whole school. So it means different things for different parts of the community, but I think one of the things that we need to do is encourage school administrators to realize that the way that they evaluate teachers, the way that they set the schedule, what Estelle was talking about earlier about when is their time for things, how they organize the day is part of what they need to think about in terms of what they're what they're making possible and what they're not making possible. And they also need to, we need to be thinking about training across the board, not just teachers or students, but all the way across.
Thank you. Anne, anything?
Yes. Well, I'm in a different position, but I do think there is an issue. There's this disconnect between the power of restorative practices and its impact on helping students become better students. There seems to be a disconnect from, in my experience, I don't think I know these circles would not have worked if I had not had a restorative principal, a leader that was willing to take a stand and say, this is what we want. And then gradually, as she began to see the students or many of the students who were in circle, less and less time in her office, that's when she then said, we've just got to keep these circles going, and found some money, a little bit to pay, and is supporting them. And then I have a new principal now who is continuing now his support of the circles, and I think, and I also have teachers now coming to me and saying, can you work with this student? And so I think that this is not a short-term process. We've got to see this as long-term, and we've got to have faith. Well, I mean, I know you can't make decisions based on faith, but I think what Carolyn's saying, there is outcome showing now statistics. I have ethnographic data. I have interviews, over 40 interviews. I just had a student this last spring tell me that he went through from a 1.9 grade average in his freshman sophomore year to a 4 because of being in the circle, having that mentor, having his friends push him to write his essay in class, get it done. And I said, well, how did you go from a 1.9 to a 4? And he said, I thought I was dumb. And so I think this sort of approach of teachers and administrators could see the impact of these restorative practices on helping students become better students and better human beings, that then there wouldn't be this disconnect. Now, I'm not in a position, I don't know how to do that, but some of you do. So that's my say about it.
I would argue just a little bit, having been in your school and know that the role that you play in that school, I would argue that you probably know a little bit more than you're giving yourself credit for.
Well, I mean, I don't really know, over the school-wide, how does one get different districts to see that connection between students becoming better students because of these restorative processes?
Yeah, thank you. Christina.
Yeah, I think for educators who are wanting to implement restorative justice, I think one of the things that they need to have is patience, and educators are incredibly resilient people to begin with, and it's patience to be on that spiral of conflict transformation, knowing that, you know, it's continually moving and that sometimes it might go backwards. It might feel as though it's really challenging, but really those moments are building capacities and strength for moving forward along what really is a transformative path to peace and community. So I think that's, you know, finding ways to partner, like many of you have been speaking about, partnering with parents, with administrators, with community members, you know, finding those allies wherever you can to really continue along this journey.
Glad you brought up parents. In what ways have you incorporated parents and caregivers and community workers into the work that you're doing? Anybody?
When I started at my current school, I was the family engagement coordinator, and we had a core of really terrifically involved and engaged parents. And as we began to build our own cross-stakeholder group, they were among the most vocal, pushing us in this direction of restorative practices. So we had some parents who were educators and knew a little bit about it, which was very helpful. But since then, we also have, again, at our board level, a family engagement board committee who looks at all of the big initiatives at the school, and they've taken this one on. This is their initiative. They own it. And I think that's a very important thing. And what we've done to support their continued ownership is that we do trainings for them. We task them to go out into the community and spread the good word, so to speak. We equip them so that they are also in the position to be apprentices. We have a very, again, back to structure and systems. The only reason that works, or one of the biggest reasons that works, is because we have very intentionally built in structures in our leadership structure where families are actually playing liaison roles between home and school. So we have something called a school family ambassador or a campus family ambassador, and they're paid a very minimal part-time wage to actually work with administrators and parent leaders and volunteers at the school to help bolster up initiatives like restorative practices initiative. So they are not only our co-learners, but our co-teachers as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think there's a lot of ways to involve parents, and I think in my experience, in some schools, the parents are really driving. Some parents end up being a very key sort of key voice in driving the process and in having a commitment to the process. And I want to say too that we've also invited parents into various talking circles. For instance, in a high school where there was a class that was really struggling, and they were really giving teachers a hard time, a high school class that had really failed a number of times. We invited parents into the conversation with the students, and it was only one or two parents who could come, but actually I have to say that presence of those parents had an impact on all of the students. So they didn't only show up for their own child, they were really there to speak to all of the students, and it was really powerful. It was powerful for the parents, and it was powerful for the students. And so I think that there's kind of endless creative ways to involve parents. I think the other thing too is that we have to encourage schools to just think about what the parents need as well to participate. So rather than asking, why aren't they showing up? Why aren't they volunteering, or why aren't they coming? Is like, why aren't they volunteering with us? Because parents do an awful lot all the time. And so just having things at night, having things around food and other kinds of ways in which parents can really feel like welcome and a part of the school is really important. And I think just encouraging people to think out of the box is really important.
I just looked at the clock and realized we have about 3 or 4 more minutes. So I'm going to open it up for any last comments on maybe advice that you'd give, or a short story you would tell, or another comment about including various stakeholders into the process. So anybody? Christina?
Yeah, I'll be very brief here because I want to connect with the last comment that Carolyn made and say that in Chicago, they actually have started something called parent peace rooms, where parents actually run conflict circles after school and allow teachers to be a part of those circles, but they actually they facilitate basically. And I think just wanted to offer that as another way that parents are getting involved in Chicago. The other thing that I would say, I loved what you said earlier, Kathy, about starting from a strength-based approach, looking at appreciative inquiry as a way to encourage people to tap into their own wisdom, I think was Carolyn's word. But your sentiment that is so important to be able to have real dialogue with folk around what they're doing that actually works and is restorative, and starting from there. Whenever you do something new, whenever change is imminent, people get nervous and it's disheveling. So you want to build up that confidence. I think Christina was talking about confidence, so that people feel like this is something they can own and take on and move forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'll close with, sometimes I tell people that, don't be afraid of this process. You can't break it. You'll get more skillful at it over time. But I think that I want to quote my good friend Dee Bell, who did a lot of training in restorative justice many years ago, where she would say, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So I'll leave with that.
And I'd just like to close by saying that this is a long-term process and we need patience. And I just encourage everyone to take a long-term vision of our path in the future.
Thanks, everyone. And I think I would just want to say that, it's really important to not forget the justice and restorative justice, and paying attention to all the ways in which we can enact and be part of justice as we circle forward. So.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate you joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan now. But thank you so much for joining us on the panel today.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank our panelists for engaging a really, really interesting conversation. If you enjoyed the conversation today, then I would encourage you to check out the website for the recordings of the other discussions we've had in this series and the other webinar recordings we've had at the Zehr Institute. We have a number of upcoming RJ webinars scheduled between now all throughout the rest of the calendar year. September 30th, Native American Spirituality and Restorative Justice. October 14th, a conversation with Lauren Walker. November 18th, Youth Leadership for Restorative Justice, an interview with Johanna Turner. And December 2nd, Lessons from 18 Years of Community Conferencing and Restorative Practices in Baltimore. All of those webinars will take place at 4:30 EST, and they all take place on a Wednesday. The Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice is located at Eastern University in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. EMU is a university that offers undergraduate degrees and several graduate programs, including a master's in conflict transformation, business administration, counseling, biomedicine, and education. EMU also has and is the host to the Summer Peacebuilding Institute, and you can learn more about our programs at emu.edu. There's been some interest in the connection between restorative justice and trauma, and the STAR training, which stands for Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, offers a research-based training program. This training program began in 2001, brings together theory and practices from neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, spirituality, and restorative justice to address the needs of trauma-impacted individuals and communities. And the program is great for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. And there are several opportunities to get connected to a STAR training. They are scheduled now through the fall of 2016, and you can find those training dates at the website emu.edu and do a search for STAR training. The Masters in Conflict Transformation program is a practice-based curriculum exploring nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict. I enjoyed the conversation that we had today, and I heard there was mention of conflict transformation approaches. This is a program that's using concepts and theories from restorative justice, but also psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, and community development. We also are offering a restorative justice graduate certificate, which is really great. It allows working professionals to continue working in their field while also reflecting on their work and increasing knowledge and skills that they have. We have in the past offered at least one course online through this same Zoom technology and platform to accommodate people who are not located in Harrisonburg. We are also pleased to offer a program in restorative justice in education. There are two ways to pursue that. There's a restorative justice in education concentration within the MA in education program, and there's also a restorative justice in education graduate certificate program available as well. All of these programs you can find online at emu.edu, and you can check it through the graduate school at EMU. Speaking of online, please check out our new website, the Zehr Institute. That is zehr-institute.org, and make sure to visit for updates on webinars, get connected to other practitioners and resources, and learn about events that are taking place. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Kathy, and would like to thank everyone for attending today.
Thank you. And I will just close by saying that one of the things that's a great honor for me is to be here at Eastern Mennonite University supporting people who are working in restorative justice fields. So I just want to put a plug in. If you have questions, concerns, anything that we can discuss with you about restorative justice, particularly in educational context, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And if you want to get in touch with some of any of the panelists today, you're not sure how to find them, please let me know. I'm sure they'd be willing to talk with you further. And we appreciate you joining us. And here's to being more restorative in this world. And happy Peace Day, right?
Yeah, happy Peace Day to you too.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
See you all.
Bye.
Bye.